What is the solution to the airline pilot shortage in America today? Because some people are suggesting that we don't even have an airline pilot shortage. And I know this is a controversial topic, especially when we start talking about raising the mandatory retirement age of airline pilots from 65 up to 67. And there are a few other solutions that are being considered right now. So that's why I want to walk through some of the facts, some of the data, and some of the different opinions and solutions that are being presented. And I really want to get your thoughts on this topic. Now, I know most of you have seen headlines in the news talking about the pilot shortage in America today. And this article from CNN from just a few weeks ago talks about the U.S. airlines is about to be hit with a tsunami of pilot retirements. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting. And when you look at this, they're really saying that there's limiting flight availability for passengers, putting upward pressure on fares. Now, according to the CEO of the Regional Airline Association, that pilot shortage has resulted in a collapse of air surface. And the big thing here they're saying is that more than half of pilots working today hit the mandatory retirement age of 65 in the next 15 years, and younger pilots are not making up for those that are aging out. But this is the real problem when we're talking about the pilot shortage. It says the large airlines hired more than 13,000 pilots in 2022, but nearly all of those came from the smaller carriers that the Regional Airline Association represents. So when we're talking about a pilot shortage, one of the things that the major airlines are dealing with is trying to replace the number of pilots that, retired early or took the early out options when COVID hit, and trying to get the staff back up to that level that they had pre-pandemic. And they're pulling a lot of that talent from the regional carriers. And so those regional carriers are really the ones that are likely suffering the most from the shortage of available pilots. And one of the reasons why they're suffering from that shortage in this next sentence is they talk about the cost of training for a new pilot can be $80,000 or as much as $200,000 if you combine that with the cost of a bachelor's degree. And this has always been a huge obstacle to entry in the aviation industry because really, if you don't want to pay for all those flight hours and their certificates, outside of the military, it's very expensive. And if you do go the military option like I do, then you're looking at typically a minimum of 10 years of service in order to get to the point where now you can get out of the military and pursue that career with the airlines. Now, I found this next article on the pilot shortage to be kind of interesting because they talk about this with the numbers behind it showing on the global scale. You're looking at pilot demand versus supply, and you can see they're forecasting almost 80,000 pilots short by the end of 2032. So that's less than 10 years away from right now. And when they shift things and talk about specifically in North America here, they're talking about the supplies being challenged because you've had the wave of early retirements during the pandemic. You've got a mandatory retirement age of 65. You've got less pilots coming out of the military, and it's a tough value proposition for candidates outside the military. So that talks about really the cost that it is to become a pilot in America today. And then this is a big one here. It's the significant training bottleneck right now is hampering the recovery effort because in order to replace all those pilots that left during COVID, you've got to put all these pilots through training, and there's a limited number of sim availability as well as instructors and things like that to get all those pilots through training to get you back up to the supply that you had pre-pandemic. And when you look at their numbers here, they're showing that pilot demand versus supply in North America, specifically by the end of 2032, you're still almost 30,000 pilots short. But, right now it looks like, if I can kind of interpret these numbers here in 2023, they're showing probably we're about 15 to 20,000 pilots short, and that's going to continue to grow over the years. However, one organization that is saying that there's not a pilot shortage in America today is the Airline Pilots Association International. So this is just straight from their website and the data that they published on this. And they're saying that over the past decade, the U.S. has produced enough certificated pilots to meet hiring demands and compensate for retirements, even as new and more rigorous training standards were enacted to enhance safety. And again, let me be clear, this is not my opinion. This is just straight from the Airline Pilots Association. You can also see in this chart that they provided, which they say is sourced from the Federal Aviation Administration, that ATP MEL issued by year cumulative. You can see for 2022, here we are in this maroon line here, and then the rolling 12 months of new ATP MELs issued. you're looking at a steady increase, going through 2022, suggesting that right now there really isn't a pilot shortage in America. It's just a management issue of those pilots and the hiring standards and things like that. So I'll leave it to you guys to comment with your opinions on that. So if you agree with the people that are saying that there's a pilot shortage in America today, what is the solution? Now, this article talks about 5 creative ways airlines are addressing the pilot shortage. And at least they acknowledge in the beginning of, is there a pilot shortage or not? And it really depends on who you ask. Now, one of the first ideas they recommend is using higher pay as an incentive. However, they're really talking about the regional airlines because this is basically saying they want to keep pilots flying and keep them from jumping to a bigger airline. As an example, within their regional airline, American Airlines is raising pilot pay by 50% with some strings attached. Now, these changes are temporary, but with contracts at multiple airlines up for renewal, it's unclear how much these rates will be rolled back when we get to the end of next year. And really, this is just a strategy in the short term to keep pilots on property longer. Now, this next idea is something that I don't think is really going to apply in America, but they are talking about bringing back retired crew, retired pilots here. Air India, in particular, the retirement age for pilots over there, I guess, is 58 years old, but they're now private. And as a result, they have retired pilots in their late 50s that could fly to age 65, just like in the U.S. I don't think airline pilots in the U.S. that have retired prior to the age of 65 are going to be interested in coming back. A lot of those retirements prior to 65 are typically due for medical reasons or other issues like that. Now, this next idea is talking about geography, but what they're really talking about here is commuters. Airline pilots are known for commuting because you can live anywhere and catch a flight to wherever you want to go to work. And what this article is saying is that if you're an airline and you're recruiting a pilot to come work for you and they don't live in a city where you have a base, well, then there's always a chance that that pilot could go work for somebody else who has a base in the city they live in or that has a base closer to where they live because it's going to make their commute easier. And honestly, this has been a challenge for the airlines ever since airlines started coming into existence because pilots have always been commuting. So I don't think there's really anything that you can do to change the geography of the situation. The next solution they suggest is to staff up with trainers. Even modest increases in a training staff can have a multiplicative increase in throughput for pilot training. So that sounds good in theory, but the problem is still there's a lack of sim availability, even if you were to increase the number of trainers. And in order to increase the number of trainers, you've got to train those people that are going to become the trainers. So you've got to put people through a short checkout program or whatever checkout program is necessary to make them qualified to teach other individuals in the simulator. And then even if you are able to increase the throughput for the simulators and get more people, done with their check ride and ready to go fly, you have to increase the number of line check airmen available to actually do those initial OE rides once they get onto the line to get them that initial operating experience to get them signed off to fly without a line check airman. And the next idea they suggest is probably the most interesting one of all here, where they're talking about starting a new airline. And the way they're doing this is it's basically a charter airline. So they're taking a 50-seat regional jet, they're removing 20 seats, so that's going to put them under different federal air regulations. And that way they can, qualify to hire first officers with 500 hours of flight experience versus 1,500 hours. Now, I don't know how you guys feel about that, and I really don't know if this idea is going to be successful. But in my opinion, this just sounds like a rolling back of, potentially some safety standards there, a way to get around this 1,500-hour requirement for some of these major airlines with the certificate requirements and things like that, and a way to try to potentially get these people ready to go to the airlines, but that still doesn't solve the training pipeline issue that a lot of the airlines are facing right now. And that brings us to the next idea, which I know is probably the most controversial, and that's raising the airline pilot retirement age to 67. However, this next article I found was kind of interesting because I learned something new. It's talking about the mandatory retirement age for airline pilots didn't exist until March of 1960 when it became a regulation, and it was an arbitrary number influenced heavily by American Airlines CEO, but really it was all about reducing cost. Now, in any case, it says the current mandatory retirement age of 65 was instituted in 2007, but this was also an arbitrary number. Although the medical argument was used again, the driving force was really about stretching the earnings of pilots who had been adversely affected by airline bankruptcies. Trying to synchronize the retirement age with Medicare eligibility was big, since most retiree medical benefits were eliminated or became cost prohibitive post-retirement. And when it comes to medical issues and disability and things like that, when we're talking about raising the retirement age, this article cites the fact that Scott Kirby, the CEO of United Airlines, stated during an interview that 36% of his 64-year-old pilots were on short-term or long-term sick leave. So there are definitely some people that will argue raising the retirement age to 67 doesn't help as much as you might think, because a good percentage of those pilots that could now potentially fly for 2 more years aren't necessarily going to fly because of medical issues or disability or things like that. But there are also some other challenges potentially associated with raising the mandatory pilot retirement age to 67. There are some people in Congress right now that are proposing this to happen, and so it's starting to gain a little bit more traction. So currently it's 65 in the US, and according to Lindsey Graham, 14,000 pilots will reach the mandatory retirement age in the next 4 years. But not everyone agrees with this assessment, and we talked about ALPA's position on this earlier, and I showed you some of the numbers for that. Now, ALPA goes on to argue that airlines with pilots over 65 years old may struggle to schedule them on many international flights, and this is because all these other countries around the world, they still have a mandatory retirement age of 65, so they'd have to raise it to 67 to match what the U.S. is doing. Because one of the things that's pretty common in the airlines is as you get older and you build up seniority working for an airline, you start shifting to flying more international. At least a lot of pilots do, because they find it to be more efficient in terms of the pay for the work that they're doing. And so if you raise the retirement age to 67, I mean, that sounds great in theory, but if you can't fly international anymore, well, then all these pilots that are in that category of, hey, I can now fly for 2 more years, they'd have to switch to domestic routes. And that might mean retraining on different aircraft, or the airlines would really have to come up with a solution to schedule them only for domestic routes, and that could present a whole new set of challenges and problems for the airlines. Now, all that being said, I want to know what your opinion is on raising the mandatory retirement age to 67 and whether you think that's a viable solution or not. Because in my opinion, it feels a little bit like we're kicking the can down the road, and this might buy some time to train more pilots from a younger generation, but ultimately we're still going to have the same number of pilots retiring. They're just going to retire 2 years later. So perhaps one of the things that we really should be focusing on is finding a way to inspire the next generation of aviators, and then finding affordable ways for them to actually become pilots. And if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.